Pope Francis changed the face of the modern papacy by shunning much of its pomp and privilege. That made him an enemy to conservatives nostalgic for a traditional past, as did his attempts to create a more inclusive and less judgmental Catholic Church. Hailing from Argentina, Francis became the first non-European pope in 1,300 years, on election in 2013. It was the first time in 6 centuries a pope was elected after his predecessor resigned. Until Benedict died nearly a decade later, unusually there were 2 men in white in the Vatican. Francis inherited a deeply divided church, and that progressive-conservative gap became a chasm. Another defining challenge, sex abuse crimes by the clergy, and how to restore credibility to a damaged Catholic Church. Conservatives were unhappy from the start with Francis' informal style and his allergy to pomp, a simplicity that endeared him to millions. They balked at his calls for the Church to be more welcoming to LGBTQ people, whom he called children of God, and divorced Catholics, and at his clampdowns on using the traditional Latin Mass. He allowed women and Muslims to take part in a Holy Thursday ritual, until then restricted to Catholic men. Capital punishment was deemed inadmissible, and he attacked the arms industry and called for the abolition of nuclear weapons. A towering conservative, the late Australian Cardinal George Pell, called his papacy a catastrophe in a memo meant to be anonymous. But Francis could disappoint the liberals too. He refused to allow some married men to be ordained in remote areas, such as the Amazon. More women took senior Vatican roles, but not as many as progressives wanted. Most of the sexual abuse crimes that shook the Church took place before Francis's election, but he had to fix the damage. 2018 was a bad year. Francis had to apologise for grave mistakes after he defended a Chilean bishop accused of sex crimes against minors. He later sent an investigator. And US Cardinal Theodore McGarrick became the first cardinal defrocked for sex abuse. In 2019, Francis summoned church leaders to a summit and issued a landmark decree, making bishops accountable for sexual abuse or for covering it up, and abolishing pontifical secrecy for abuse cases. For victims groups, though, it was all too little, too late. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was the grandson of Italians who emigrated to Argentina during the Depression. He was born in Buenos Aires in 1936. He was the head of the Jesuit order during the dictatorship in the 70s and 80s, during which thousands of suspected leftists were kidnapped and killed. The Vatican has denied accusations by critics in Argentina that he stayed silent and failed to protect 2 priests who didn't. His papal name came from Francis of Assisi, the saint associated with concern for the poor. Pope Francis renounced luxurious apartments at the Vatican for a modest hotel he never moved out of, setting an example for cardinals he said lived like princes. He sent the bulletproof Pope-mobile off to a museum and was driven round in a car with few security features. Followers touched by tragedy or problems might pick up the phone to hear, "This is Francis." He was dubbed the Cold Call Pope. Pope Francis enjoyed international prestige. He spoke out for refugees and criticised countries that shunned migrants. Under his watch, the Vatican and the United Nations teamed up on climate change, and he published a landmark encyclical calling for a break from fossil fuels in 2015. The Pope, as leader of the 1.4 billion member Roman Catholic Church, is usually careful about taking sides in conflicts. But he was more outspoken about Israel's military campaign against Palestinian militant group Hamas, following the October 7, 2023 cross-border attack on southern Israel. He wrote how some international experts said that, quote, "What is happening in Gaza has the characteristics of a genocide." From day one of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Francis regularly made appeals for peace at his public appearances. He saw his own inability to bring an end to that war as a great disappointment of his papacy.